Are you ever just craving the sweet whimsy of a historical puffy shirt, but see all of the historical examples in white and think, I need this, but in a slightly darker shade of goth, because this happens to me a lot. So today I'm going to remedy that and make one. And if you would like to make one too, come and join me, for I have a pattern for you, which I'll talk more about in a bit. For now, I'm starting with this nice black lightweight linen, which I've pre-washed and pressed since I plan to wash the finished garment quite a bit when it's in a wearable state. These shirts historically are almost always made from linen since it was an abundant, durable, comfortable, and easy to wash material. And although period-wise I'm working in Regency, the basic pattern is almost exactly like the 18th century quote-unquote pirate shirt that I did a few years back, which is the basic pattern for shirts and shifts pretty much all throughout history. I'm just making a couple of minor Regency-specific concessions this time around, which I will be addressing as we go. Shirts and shifts are so satisfying to work on because they're pretty much made up entirely of squares and rectangles. This means perfect angles and precisely straight lines, which means we can achieve those perfectly on-grain cuts by drawing out threads in the material and using that gap as a cutting guide. Thread drawing is usually pretty difficult on the eyes, but black on black was a whole new brand of torment. I ended up finding it easiest to cut sort of vertically, holding the fabric up to the window so the light came through and I could see the cutting channel better, or holding it over a white piece of paper if I had some bright early morning sunlight. I might be beginning to see why black wasn't a popular choice for shirts. I'm also just trimming off the fluffs from the selvage edge. Unlike today, selvages were cherished historically, not just cut off and discarded. It was basically a get-out-of-hemming-free card, so cutting on a selvage wherever possible was a great time-saving hack. Only historical selvages were straight and non-fluffy, so I'm just trimming that off. It doesn't make any structural difference to the garment to leave it on, but I just like to take it off for aesthetic purposes. Once all my pieces are cut out, I can begin the stitching. I'm doing this all by hand since sewing machines weren't yet a thing in the Regency period, but also mostly because I enjoy it. I'll be using a black linen thread to accompany my linen garment, which was a super common thread used historically. This does need to be waxed for ultimate strength though. Linen fibers are prone to catching on the fabric and weakening as you stitch, so this just helps your thread to maintain its strength whilst you put it into place. I'm starting off just by putting a hem onto the two main shirt body pieces, since it'll be easier to handle these two pieces when they're individual, rather than waiting for the whole shirt to be fully made up before hemming. Next, I'm going to make up the sleeves so they're all ready to go for later. This is begun by placing one gusset square in one of the top corners of the sleeve piece and stitching it just along that one sleeve seam edge. All of the main seam stitching on this project is done with a backstitch for strength. These shirts needed to withstand a lot, so they had to be made as indestructibly as possible. I'm stopping this gusset seam a seam allowance width from the edge, which in my case is around 1/4 of an inch, but maybe up to 1/2 inch if you're using the pattern. I'm bringing the thread down to the underside of the seam before cutting it, so it'll be hidden and out of the way when I finish these seams later. Now I successfully have one gusset appendage and can seam up the other side. This adjacent gusset seam will run seamlessly, not literally, there will definitely be a seam here, into the main sleeve seam to form a fully enclosed sleeve, minus the bottom circa 3.5 inches or so, which I'm leaving unstitched and hemming separately, so there's a bit of room to fit the sleeve over the hand. In terms of the seam finishing, I'm taking care of the shorter gusset seam first so that the longer seam can fold over that junction and hide everything nicely. I've already trimmed away about half the width of the seam allowance going under the fold so that it's less bulky to turn over. All the seams on this project are going to be turned and felled like this, as was probably the most common method of seam finishing across centuries of pre-machine sewing. And before I move on from this task, I'm just placing some reinforcement patches at the junction of that cuff slit. Any point where a seam splits off into open space like this is going to be ripe for easy damage, so strengthening these points, especially on hard-wearing garments like these, is very desirable. I'm adding one patch to each side. This will also help to hide the less neat finishing at the top point where the seam allowance has had to be clipped to split off. And with the first seams done, I'm putting the finishing touches on these sleeves, i.e. making them sleeves. Quick detour to run a gathering stitch across the top edge that'll connect to the shoulder, which is running just along the main sleeve piece but not extending down into the gusset. I've also done the same to the cuff edge the full way round, which is actually relevant to our current sleeve purposes. I'm preparing two cuff shapes, slightly slimmer than the 18th century shirt cuffs I've done previously. These are only going to be about 1.5 inches or so, just to try something different. Cuff widths vary across these periods, so why not have some fun with it? The more practical way to do this is to fold the cuff in half lengthwise, stitch the short ends, and then turn the whole thing right side out, but for some reason I decided to do this the hard way by folding the short edges in and whip stitching them from the outside. I have no good explanation for this. I'm marking the halfway and quarter points on my sleeve so that I can match these up to the points on the cuffs and gather into smaller increments. And the now gathered sleeve is stitched down into the cuff with a backstitch, with every stitch stepping in between one of the folds for ultimate security, and to make sure that my gathers stay nice and neat. The other side of the cuff gets felled down for a nice invisible stitch. One thing that a lot of 18th and early 19th century shirts feature is a little gore just at the sides of the neck. This just helps the shirt to sit a bit more comfortably across the body, so I'm going to add one of these into this project. The gores can be cut from one circa 3 by 2 inch rectangle, and they're going to be attached first to the back body piece, but first I need to mark a few points. The center back, of course, and also the length of the shoulder seam, which for me is going to be around 8.5 inches. The end point of this seam is where I'll line up the neck edges of the gores. Meanwhile, on the front body piece, I'm finding my center front point, which will allow me to cut the center front opening slit. I'm cutting this 5 inches down, but historical men's shirts often go a bit lower. For some reason I decided this would be the best point to attach the front and back body pieces before finishing that front neck edge, which doesn't seem logical, but we're going with it. In what seems to be a further procrastination of the finishing of the neck slit, I'm taking a quick detour to make up the collar by just backstitching around both short ends and one long end with a narrow bit of seam allowance. Yes, there is a piecing on this because I forgot that this collar buttons shut and I need a bit of overlap, but piecing is period, as they say. And by they, I mean me. I say piecing is period, because it is. It's evident on lots of extant historical garments. Anyway, these seams are then just finger-pressed flat, since linen is super creasy and basically folds like paper, so you can save some ironing time here. And then I'm turning the collar right side out. I'm also hemming the edges of two 2-inch wide strips of fabric that I'll be adding to the neck edge as a frill later, as was sometimes popular to add to shirts in this late 18th/early 19th century period. These are twice as long as the length of the neck slit to account for the gathering, so 2 inches wide by, in my case, 10 inches long to ease into the 5-inch neck slit. Okay, now I'm actually finishing the neck slit with a tiny, narrow little felt hem, and once again a little reinforcement patch at the bottom for security. Now to do up the side seams and turn this into a shirt. I'm measuring down half the circumference of the arm's eye, which for me is 8.5 inches. I'll leave this open for the sleeve hole and we'll backstitch down the rest of the way until I reach the hem slit point of about 7 inches up from the hem. This slit in the side seam will be left loose and hemmed separately for ease of movement. So let's talk patterns, because I know a lot of you have been asking for years to be able to make the things in the videos at home, and I am so excited to finally be starting to bring this to you. I've teamed up with Michelle of Clockwork Fairy, who is an incredible pattern maker. Some of you might already be familiar with her shop, but she has the perfect combination of top-tier pattern drafting skills with knowledge of historical dress, so she's kind of the perfect person to get to team up with. We've based this pattern on the 18th century pirate shirt, as previously seen and highly requested on this channel, which is the same pattern that I've used for this project as well, with the exception of the adjusted cuff width and the addition of the neck frills. The pattern is exactly the same one that I used previously. But we've also added a couple of pieces to the pattern which were common in historical shirt examples, and which I'm adding to this project too, like the neck gussets and 2 additional pieces we'll be getting into in a bit. I'll talk about this a bit more in future as more patterns are ready for release, but you guys get a bit of an advance heads up here. Check the link in the description if you want to check out Michelle's shop and or get this shirt pattern for yourself. Stay there. Good girls. Now, about these extra pieces. The first is this wide shoulder patch which starts around 2 inches below the front arm's eye, travels up and around over the shoulder and down to the same point on the back, meeting at the side seam. The top of the shoulder and around the sleeve historically were prime wear points, since these shirts were most commonly worn under waistcoats and jackets, so these areas were the prime contact points with other materials and thus needed a bit of extra strength. For this shoulder patch, which is historically called a binder or a lining in the 1838 Workwoman's Guide, which is where we're basing these pieces from, we're attaching this to the inside of the garment, which will be super useful later because it'll help us to finish the sleeve seams super neatly. I'm folding in the raw edges around the 2 bottom edges and the inner long edge and felling these down with super small stitches that will be seen from the front, hopefully as minimally as possible. The long edge around the arm's eye is going to be left loose for now. The second additional little reinforcement piece is called a shoulder strap by the Workwoman's Guide and was also a common way to keep those shoulder areas nice and strong. These are around 2-inch strips that run from the neck edge to the sleeve seam along the shoulder seam and conceal that neck gusset. I folded in the long edges preemptively so that it's super easy to just pin and fell into place. This time we're working on the right side of the garment, by the way. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a seamster in possession of a shirt must be in want of some buttons. Fortunately, the 18th and 19th century possess some exquisite examples of thread-worked buttons that I am dying to learn how to make. Historical button expert Gina B. Silkworks has put a bunch of super helpful tutorials here on YouTube, so I will direct you to the link in the description should you wish for much more competent instruction on this. But my assistant Heathcliff and I spent a marvelous afternoon learning the art of button making, which was simultaneously diverting and mind-bending at how much work went into these things. Granted, we're absolute beginners at this, but we each spent about 30 to 45 minutes making our first buttons. This is so hard! No, I think it's all unraveling. No!
Okay, when the middle bit. I've done this 27 times.
Like, I need a microscope. I chose the Dorset button style for this project, which requires a small metal ring and some silk thread to work, all of which was conveniently available through Gina's shop. Shout out to Gina for inadvertently taking care of all of our button needs for this project, and Heathcliff ended up making around 10 of these, but we only ended up needing 3, 2 at the cuffs and 1 at the neck, which will be attached with corresponding buttonholes in black silk buttonhole twist. Now to put in the sleeves. Turning the shirt inside out, I can place my right side out sleeves into the armhole, pin the gusset section in smoothly, and then gather the rest of the sleeve to fit. The sleeve is backstitched all around, making sure that the loose shoulder binder piece remains loose and does not get stitched into the arm's eye seam. Once the seam is finished, that loose shoulder binder edge gets folded in, laid over top of the raw arm's eye seam, and felled into place to hide everything nicely. Now for the finishing touches. First, the shoulder frill, finally, which gets gathered into the neck slit edge and stitched into place. I had hemmed all 4 edges of this before gathering with the intent of making this easily removable girls, ma'ams, oh my gosh. Yes, Lyra. I know your squeaks are so cute, but like not right now. I had hemmed all 4 edges of this before gathering with the intent of making this easily removable depending on my mood, but that hemmed edge does make it a bit bulkier than it would have been historically. But I'm not keen to unpick and re-hem the neck edge if I decide to take the frill off at any point, which I'd have to do if it were properly integrated with the shirt. And finally, the loose neck edge of the shirt gets gathered down into the collar. It helps once again to mark the halfway and quarter points of the collar piece so that these can be matched to the center back and shoulder seams of the shirt for the most even gathering experience. I'm also extending about 1/2 inch of the collar on one side. This will be where the collar overlaps for buttoning. When gathering, I'm leaving the area around the neck gusset smooth so that the shirt hangs nicer over the body. The collar is then backstitched to the shirt only on that inner layer, leaving the outer layer of the collar free for now. That outer edge gets tucked in and felled down to hide the raw edges, just as we did for the arm's eye. And one last button to close the collar. Some historical shirts have multiple buttons, some have just one, some have none at all. Maker discretion is advised. New shirt unlocked. Every time I contemplate a new project, I always try and convince myself to stop making black things. They don't shoot well, they're hard to see when stitching at night. I have made so much black on this channel, I expect people are starting to get very bored with me at this point. But then I finish said black garment, and I put it on, and it's a garment that just sings to my soul. These are the clothes that I live in and that I reach for the most. So it is worth it, I guess. I will continue endeavoring to venture into the world of color for the sake of your entertainment, but today, I suppose, is not that day. And, to be honest, I can't say a single regret is had. Anyway, if you would like a shirt pattern for yourself, perhaps to show me up and make one in bright yellow or pink tartan or polka dots, the link is once again in the description. Tag me on Instagram if you do make one up for yourself. I would love to see them. There's nothing quite like a fine piece of clothing to help one convey a desired illusion. Funnily enough, a VPN works in very much the same way, and downright hilariously, NordVPN happened to be the very VPN sponsoring this video. NordVPN is the fastest VPN service out there, helping you to encrypt your online traffic so that you can stay secure without pesky interruptions. Because as far as your internet service provider or any public Wi-Fi networks are concerned, you are just a Regency gentleman going about your very uninteresting business, not a fermenting cave goblin with the intellectual equivalence of a marshmallow. And with NordVPN, you also get to take advantage of hot accoutrements such as password management, data breach scanning, and dark web monitoring to help you make sure that your online data is kept secure. Get the exclusive NordVPN deal at nordvpn.com/Bernadette. It is risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. So sweaty. There's fully like a whole crowd of people just watching my shenanigans. Hang on, I just need to try again. Right, you have to start on top of the burrito. No, I don't have arms now. Should I just do the whole ad like this? Oh my god, Danny, you're gonna have so much garbage footage. Where's the mic? No. Well, I'm never getting up.